Welcome to CLNS.
Today we have a special presentation for all viewers.
We will be looking back to the 1970s, and we will discuss two very important events that happened and their connection to each other and the overall theme of the 1970s.
The two events are Curt Flood and the introduction of free agency, the occupation of Wounded Knee by AIM in 1973.
Wounded Knee, 1973. The American Indian movement captured the town near Wounded Knee to rebel against the government which wouldn't honor any of treaties made in the past, and to rebel against the corruption at the corporate level and the American Indian government. Dick Wilson, the leader, accepted bribes, awarded positions that weren't rightfully deserved, and third, he allowed the mining at the Indian reservation.
Curt Flood was a professional baseball player for 13 years. He won 3 Gold Gloves, went to 2 World Series. He won 7 Gold Gloves, went to 2 World Series, and was 3-time All-Star. While achieving all this success on the field, what he did off the field was more important. Curt Flood led a revolution that, in the end, changed free agency and gave professional athletes more freedom and more power against owners. In that day, the owners had something called a reserve clause, which let players not be able to negotiate contracts with owners. This reserve clause was highly controversial, but because of a decision made in 1922 by the Supreme Court saying that baseball was not part of the antitrust laws added earlier in the 1880s, the reserve clause was therefore deemed legal. Curt Flood was traded from the Cardinals to the Phillies, and in refusing this trade, Curt Flood then decided to fight the reserve clause in courts, which ended up losing his career. In the end, though, Curt Flood started a revolution against owners and the abuse of power they had, which ended up starting the addition to free agency. Curt Flood's revolution ended up starting giving players the opportunity and the courage to fight free agency, and later on were able to gain the free agency that we all know in sports to this day.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, Lawrence. And looking back at the American Indian movement, it definitely had an effect on the outcome of the Indians' rights. They definitely received a whole lot more rights than they had before, and they were noticed more by the nation. And going back to Dick Wilson quickly, Lawrence, I think the connection between these two major events is the corruption at the head levels. Mm-hmm. They took advantage of minorities, the minorities being the American Indians and major athletes during the 1970s, 60s, and 50s. And the corruption. Corruption was definitely a big deal.
Exactly. Just as with Dick Wilson, the corruption of the MLB stemmed from the head level, which was the owners. The owners didn't give athletes any say in negotiating their contract. Athletes would just walk in, they'd say, "This is what we're paying you. If you don't like it, then we'll just renew your contract from last year." So athletes had no power either to sign it or they had to retire. And owners took advantage of these minorities, just like the head politicians of the Indians took advantage of the Indians. They had zero freedoms when it came to contracts with the owners, and it led to corruption of the higher power because of the greed of the owners, and they took advantage of minorities that were powerless to these owners.
Going back to Dick Wilson, as I said before, he accepted bribes to allow people into head positions that they wouldn't otherwise serve as, and that allowed him to keep power. He kept money for himself that should have gone to the American Indian cause and the American Indian movement mainly. And he allowed strip mining in the reservation that he was the head of, Lawrence. So it was bad. Just poison water, which led to mortality rates went up, birth defects went up, which is an awful situation overall. And I think that's the main connection between these 2 points. As I said, the corruption and the taking advantage of minorities. Mm-hmm.
I completely agree. As with Curt Flood, Curt Flood felt like a slave compared to the owners. He said that the owners could ship away players to any other franchise based on the whims of, as he called, 24 millionaires. He compared this to back in the early 1800s when we had slavery and slave owners could just sell away and split up families based on whatever based on the whims of themselves.
Definitely.
And this also with the fact that the players had no control over where they wanted to play. Curt Flood didn't get to choose where he wanted to play, which is something he said. He had many business ventures, such as a Photoshop, portrait painting business in St. Louis, and that would all go by the wayside if he had to end up moving to Philly in the trade. And if he had to, in this way, if he had free agency, he could sign with whatever team he wanted and go play where he wanted to, which was the owners took advantage of players and didn't give them this freedom. In the end, both of these events connect to the overarching theme of the 1970s, which was these revolutions were symbols of minorities fighting for their own power and to gain recognition among these head level hierarchy positions.
Definitely.
They're fighting against the abuse of power, and they're fighting to gain freedoms that normal people would have, such as with the freedoms of the Indians and the freedom of being able to negotiate contracts, which every other business had, except for Major League Sports.
Definitely. They also match up with events such as the civil rights. The Black Power movement also was a great influence. I think that's all the time we have today, Lawrence. Thank you for joining us at CLNS. See you next time for our presentation of sports.